Hello, everyone. Today we're going to be going over the first official question of midterm 1, which is the arrays question. And so part A goes as follows. Suppose we want to write the method sum to k, which accepts an integer array r and an integer k, and returns true if the sum of all the elements in r equals k, and false otherwise. The signature for the method is below. Public static boolean sum to k, integer given integer array r and integer k. And so with this method header, we as a student know that this method is static. It returns a boolean, and as said earlier, it takes in two parameters, an integer array r and an integer k. So now we go on to part 1 of part A. Before we code the method, let's first write a test. Implement the test sum to k so that we test the following behavior. And the behavior is here as follows. Calling sum to k on an empty array should return true when k is 0 and otherwise. And calling return sum to k on a non-empty array should return true when k is equal to the sum of the array and false otherwise. Note, for the false assertions, you only need to check sum to k returns false for an arbitrary value of k, so long as k isn't equal to the sum of the array. Hint, you should only need to add 4 lines of code. And I want to really point out this hint because this is really going to guide us on how we actually write the test. And so now that we know we only need to add in 4 lines, let's think about what are the 4 lines that we actually need to add. And I feel like it's very well explained in these bullet points on what 4 lines to add. And how do we split these 2 bullet points into 4 lines? Oh, we can actually see that these 2 bullet points actually splits it up into 4 lines for itself really easily, actually. And so we can split it into 4 lines as follows. Calling sum to k on an empty array should return true when k is 0. That itself is 1 line. And false otherwise, that is also another line where we test that sum to k on an empty array returns false if k is given, which is not 0. And then you have this bullet point. Calling sum to k on a non-empty array should return true when k is equal to the sum of the array. That itself is our 3rd line. And then we have and false otherwise. That is our 4th line where we easily check that k is not equal to the sum of the array. It would return false for that. And so now we can write out the method, write out the 4 lines of code that we need. Because we know that, as you can see here, we already know that sum to k returns a boolean. We can use the assert true and assert false for simplicity. And so let's start off with our first line. Calling sum to k on an empty array should return true when k is 0. So first we do assert true, since we're working with the true case here. And then we want to call sum to k on an empty array along with that empty array as the parameter, along with 0 as the k parameter. We actually already have an empty array defined for us here, where where empty r is simply defined as the empty array. And so we can call sum to k. One note here is because this method is static, we don't need to have sum to k as any sort of object method. It's simply a static method. So we can call sum to k like this. And in sum to k, as I said earlier, we need to pass in the empty r because we're working with an empty array in this case. And then we want to make sure that it returns 0 when an empty array is passed in. And so as a result, we can just add 0 for the k parameter. And this is our first case. Our second case is this and false otherwise, which means that most of it is the same, except that the k we pass in is not 0. And because we're working with a false assertion here, we go here, assert false. And so that takes into account that this is a false assertion. Then we do sum to k again. We pass in the same empty array. And now we pass in a number that is not 0. In this case, we will make it 1. And then that is all the sort of test cases we've taken into account on the first line. Now we do the same for the second line. For the second bullet point, for our 3rd and 4th lines of code. calling sum to k on a non-empty array should return true when k is equal to the sum of the array. And what works really well for us is the fact that they've already defined an array for us, which has the elements 1, 2, 3, 4 in that order. If we do a quick sum, we know that the sum of these elements is 10, 4 plus 3 is 7, plus 2 is 9, plus 1 is 10. And so with that, we then can go on to write our next assertion, which is a true assertion. So it will be assert true. And then we call sum to k on a non-empty array. So we will use R. And then we know that the sum of this is 10. And so it would have to return true if this is the case. And then we have our final line, which is the other false assertion here and false otherwise. And so it would just be assert false, sum to k, R, and it has to be any number other than 10. So we can just go with 9. And so that's that. We've written our test. Now we move on to the next part of part A, which is now let's actually code the method sum to k. And you may use a maximum of 8 lines of code. Note that the staff solution only uses 5. Before we begin actually coding the method, let's think about how we want to sort of approach this. We know that the name of the method is sum to k and it's Boolean. So, and as stated earlier, we want to make sure that the sum of the array, whether it's empty or not, has to equal to k. And so what we do is, and so if we simply plan out what we have to do here, we know that 1, we have to find the sum of R, and then 2, return whether sum is equal to k. And so that is what the logic of the code that we have to use here. And so with that, we can easily come up with very simple code to actually find this to go through each step. And so for our first step, which is find the sum of the array or of R, in this case, what we have to do is first initialize a sum parameter, a sum variable to 0, because that will be our sum. And then we can easily iterate through each of the elements in array in R and add that to the sum. And so we can use a regular for loop here. You can also use an enhanced for loop here, but for simplicity reasons, I'm just going to use a regular for loop. And then here we do sum plus equals R index I. And in this case, we know that this works because since we go through each index of the array, we are taking that specific element from each, we're taking each specific element from the array and we're adding that to sum. So we know that our sum is going to be correct. And so once we do that, now we need to return whether sum is equal to k. And that is simply returning sum is equal to k. And because we have these double equals here, we know that it will return a Boolean, so which actually maps this. And so as a result, there's nothing more that we need to worry about here. That is part A. Yeah, we have successfully finished coding the method and we wrote a test that works. And so we can now move on to part B.